Lecture 11, Sophocles.
Welcome back to Lecture 11, in which we will continue our discussion of Greek tragedy by looking at the life and work of Sophocles, the second of the three great Athenian tragedians. We're fortunate to know more about the life of Sophocles than we do about Aeschylus's life, or at least we think we know more about Sophocles. The reliability of some of the details that we have about his life are questionable, but even so, the details that we do have about him give us a picture of how Sophocles was regarded in antiquity, whether they're accurate biographically or not. He was born in 496 and he died in 406, thus he lived to be 90 years old. He held several important positions in Athenian political and religious life during that very long lifetime. His political and military offices included being a treasurer of Athena, an important financial responsibility, in 443 through 442 BC, and he served as one of 10 annually elected generals in 441 through 440. That was the year when the great statesman Pericles also served as a general. On the religious side, Sophocles was a priest of a local hero. Hero in the religious sense means a spirit who could help the living, the spirit of a dead person who could in some way help the living. Sophocles was a priest of a local hero, and when the cult of the healing god Asclepius was introduced into Athens, Sophocles temporarily housed the sacred snake, which symbolized the god Asclepius, in his own house, which was a position of great trust in the religious side of things. After his death, Sophocles himself, we're told, was revered as a hero, and he was given the new name Dexion, which means the receiver, referring to his having received the snake of Asclepius into his house while the temple was being built. Now, all of these details would indicate that he was held in very high esteem and trust. We're also told by the comic playwright Aristophanes, among others, that he was an extremely likable man, good-tempered and easygoing and easy to get along with. We have references in our sources to Sophocles' friendships with other important literary figures of 5th century Athens, such as, for instance, the historian Herodotus, whom we'll talk about in a few more lectures. There are some passages in Sophocles' works, especially in the play Antigone, where he seems to quote Herodotus. Now, there's a problem with taking that as evidence that the two men knew one another. Perhaps it is, but equally well, it could be that some author writing 2-3 centuries later, compared the passage in Sophocles, the passage in Herodotus, saw that they looked alike and said, aha, these men must have known each other, came up with the idea of the friendship. So whether a friendship between the two explains the similarity in their works, or whether the similarity in their works gave rise to the story of the friendship, unfortunately, we can't know. We do know a good bit about Sophocles' working career. It spans the years 468 BC to 406, the year of his death. And during this long career, he wrote probably 123 plays total. Remember, Aeschylus wrote probably 90 total. Sophocles wrote probably 123 plays. Very unfortunately, just as with Aeschylus, only 7 of Sophocles' plays have survived. That is a terrible loss. It's even more of a handicap in our assessment of Sophocles than it is in our assessment of Aeschylus. For one thing, since Sophocles wrote more plays than Aeschylus, we have an even smaller percentage of his work left. 7 out of 123 is a pitifully small sample. Most of Sophocles' plays cannot be securely dated. We don't have secure records for when they were performed, and that makes it hard to make statements about the development of Sophocles' style, though scholars will do this all the time. They'll talk about the early Sophocles and the late Sophocles, working from a sample of only 7 plays, and make statements about the development of his style, but that's problematic when we have so very little to go on. And unfortunately, since we cannot securely date the plays, it's also hard to make comments about their relationship to contemporary events, the way I did with the Oresteia in the last lecture. We don't have a secure date for most of Sophocles' surviving plays, so we can't tie them to contemporary events in the same way. However, the one bit of good news is that since Sophocles seems to have abandoned the trilogy form, unlike Aeschylus, he did not write unified trilogies on a single theme. That means that we can talk about an individual play in isolation in a way that is much more difficult to do with Aeschylus. Imagine, for instance, if out of the Oresteia, libation bearers and Eumenides had not survived and we had only Agamemnon, we could not really assess what Aeschylus was doing with the themes of vengeance and contradictory duties and so forth that he so clearly sets up in Agamemnon if we did not have libation bearers and Eumenides to let us see those themes develop. So with Aeschylus, when we have only one play out of a trilogy, we are at a great handicap in analyzing that play, as is the situation with the other surviving plays of Aeschylus. With Sophocles, since he wrote self-contained plays and not continuous trilogies, we can at least talk with a bit more safety about the plays as self-contained units. Within even just the 7 plays that we have left of Sophocles' work, we can note some characteristic Sophoclean elements, some ways in which he differs both from Aeschylus before him and from Euripides, who we'll talk about in the next lecture. Sophocles concentrates more on the individual than Aeschylus did. He pays more attention to the main individual character in his plays. And in addition, the gods in Sophocles' plays are remote and unreachable. Unlike Apollo and Athena, who take part in the action of Eumenides, the gods in Sophocles' plays are, for the most part, remote and unreachable. Athena does appear as a character in the play Ajax, and I'll come back to that in a few minutes. But far more than Aeschylus, Sophocles focuses the audience's attention on the human elements of the stories he tells, on the human condition, without the direct intervention of gods either to help or to hinder us. Now, in Sophocles' seven extant plays, all but one is named for the main character, the individual main character. There's one of Sophocles' plays, Trachiniae, the Women of Trachis, which is named for its chorus, but the other 6 surviving plays, Ajax, Antigone, Electra, Oedipus the King, Oedipus at Colonus, and Philoctetes, all 6 of those are named for their protagonists, for their main characters. And these protagonists, all 6 of them, are characterized by a kind of, well, it could be called heroic or splendid isolation. The great scholar and critic Bernard Knox points out that the plots of these 6 plays all fit a basic pattern. We don't know how many of Sophocles' other plays would have fit this same pattern, but these 6 do. The main character, Antigone, Ajax, Electra, whoever, is faced with a crisis in which disaster can only be averted by a compromise that, in that protagonist's view, would constitute betrayal of something that the protagonist holds to be supremely important. For instance, in the play Antigone, Antigone is faced with the decree by her uncle, the king Creon, that she must not bury the body of her dead brother. She chooses to go ahead and bury his body anyway, in part because, as you'll remember from the lecture on the Iliad, an unburied body means that the soul cannot go into the underworld. And so Antigone, remember Patroclus came as a ghost to Achilles and said, "Please give my body burial." Antigone chooses to bury her brother despite the fact that the king has decreed death for anyone who buries this man, because she cannot leave her brother's soul to wander forever. So the only way disaster could have been averted would be for Antigone to compromise her principles and leave her brother unburied. So that's the first element in the pattern that Knox identifies in Sophocles' plays. The main character is faced with a crisis. Disaster can only be averted if the main character will compromise or betray his or her principles, and he or she won't. The protagonist refuses to compromise, in fact, despite being urged to by persuasive speeches. To use Antigone as an example again, her sister Ismene tries to persuade her to go along with the decree of the king. The protagonist is also often faced with threats or actual violence, or all three, appeals, threats, and violence. The protagonist holds firm and won't compromise, and the end result usually is the destruction of the protagonist. So Knox sees this basic pattern at work in 6 of Sophocles' 7 surviving plays. Now, Aeschylus's characters, Agamemnon and Orestes, for instance, are often confronted with crises or dilemmas as well. There's no question about that, and I talked about that at some length in the last lecture. However, in Aeschylus's extant work, at least, I always have to say that, we don't know what Aeschylus and Sophocles may have done in the missing place, but in Aeschylus's extant work, the protagonist is not offered a way out. Neither Agamemnon nor Orestes has any middle course. Orestes can't sort of avenge his father's death and sort of kill his mother, or vice versa. He has to choose one course or the other. And Agamemnon, similarly, either has to kill Iphigenia and sail to Troy, or spare Iphigenia and not sail to Troy. There isn't any compromise. There isn't any middle way. Aeschylus, at least in the Oresteia, focuses on people caught between irreconcilable duties without a possibility of compromise. Now, this in itself certainly portrays human beings struggling under terrible circumstances, but it doesn't foreground the self-chosen or self-imposed isolation of those characters the way Sophocles' plays do. In other words, Aeschylus's characters may be isolated and tormented through the force of circumstance, but Sophocles' characters choose and maintain their own isolation through their resistance, their refusal to compromise, their resistance to both pleas and threats. Now, whether this is indicative of admirable integrity or bullheaded stubbornness is very much a matter of opinion, and different people will interpret Sophocles' main characters in different ways, obviously. This pattern of the isolated protagonist is already observable in Ajax, which most scholars think is Sophocles' earliest extant play. Ajax probably dates to sometime in the 440s, though we cannot clearly and definitely date it. In Ajax, Sophocles dramatizes the story of the suicide of the hero Ajax, who was a warrior in the Trojan War. The background story is quite simple. Ajax was the second greatest Greek warrior in the Trojan War, second only to Achilles. And when Achilles withdrew from battle, Ajax became the foremost warrior among the Greeks. He's referred to as their bulwark in the Iliad. He protects them in a very, very memorable scene when the Trojans have reached the Greek ships, have set the ships on fire in the Iliad. Most of the Greek army is demoralized. Ajax is described as leaping from the deck of one ship to another, fighting the Trojans single-handedly, basically holding off the whole Trojan army almost on his own. Ajax is a very, very great warrior. After Achilles' death, the Greeks had to decide who should be awarded Achilles' armor. This was armor that had been made for him by the god Hephaestus. It was extremely special and important armor indeed. And again, in the system of Time and Kleos that I talked about in the lecture on the Iliad, the gift of Achilles' armor is an indication of which warrior is now held in the highest esteem, which one has the most time now that Achilles is dead. The two contestants for Achilles' armor were Ajax and Odysseus. So the question was, which do the Greeks prize more highly? Ajax's prowess in battle, his courage, his defense of them, or Odysseus' skill in rhetoric, in trickiness, in craftiness, in quick thinking? The vote went for Odysseus, and in shame over what he saw as an affront to his own honor, Ajax committed suicide. So that's the background story. Homer knows of this story because in Odysseus' visit to the underworld in the Odyssey, Odysseus sees and speaks to the soul of Ajax and says, "I wish I had never taken that armor. Had I known that it would cost your life, I wouldn't have wanted it." Begs Ajax to speak to him. Ajax walks by him in silence. So Ajax's resentment over this affront to his honor carries on even into the afterlife. Now, Sophocles takes this basic storyline and he focuses on Ajax's reaction to the loss of the armor. In Sophocles' treatment, Ajax is driven mad, is directly driven mad by the goddess Athena, who, remember, is Odysseus' patron. In his madness, Ajax sets out to kill the other members of the Greek army. He sets out to kill his fellow soldiers because they've dishonored him by giving Achilles' armor to Odysseus. But in his madness, he slaughters sheep, thinking that they are his fellow soldiers. He takes other sheep captive and lodges them in his tent. When Ajax returns to his senses, he's overcome with shame at his folly in killing and capturing the sheep. This is not a noble or heroic action. He comes back to his senses and realizes that he, the great warrior, has been going around slaughtering sheep and taking sheep captive. He's overcome with shame at this ridiculous action that he's taken. Despite the pleas of his wife Tecmessa, he decides to kill himself rather than live with this shame. So Sophocles' emphasis is on Ajax's shame at failing in his attempt at revenge and at killing only animals. As Sophocles presents the story, shame at losing the armor itself is secondary, and this is very different from the treatment of this story in other authors. Homer, for instance, as I've already mentioned, in the Odyssey, in the underworld scene with Odysseus, says nothing at all about Ajax going mad and slaughtering sheep. The idea is that Ajax killed himself over shame at not being awarded Achilles' armor. And Pindar has also treated the story, and he also says that Ajax killed himself as shame over the armor. Sophocles' innovation is to have Ajax kill himself over shame at slaughtering animals in his madness. So the loss of the armor in Sophocles motivates Ajax's desire for vengeance against all the Greeks in general, not his desire for suicide. His desire for suicide comes out of shame over his botched vengeance. And very, very interestingly, and rather disturbingly for modern audiences, I think, neither Ajax nor any other character calls into question the justification of his desire to murder all his fellow soldiers over armor. That's what we would expect the playwright to focus on. How could he have done this? And yet, how could he have wanted to do this? How could he have wanted to kill his fellow soldiers just because they voted to give Achilles' armor to Odysseus rather than to him? But neither Ajax nor any other character questions that. That doesn't seem to be a problem, his desire to murder his fellow soldiers. The problem is that instead he killed sheep. Now, Ajax's character is marked by fierceness and by emotional coldness. He's unresponsive to the pleas of his wife Tecmessa that he should think of her and of their little son and not kill himself. She has some very moving speeches in which she describes what will happen to her and to their son if Ajax does indeed kill himself and leave them alone and unprotected. He does not respond to this at all. He's simply not moved by these pleas. Ajax clearly operates under the Homeric code of action, in which insults require bloody vengeance and death is preferable to shame. In contrast, interestingly enough, Odysseus adheres to a more modern worldview, modern in the sense of 5th century, which allows for compromise. Odysseus, for instance, feels pity for Ajax when Athena displays him, even though Ajax is Odysseus' enemy. At the beginning of the play, Athena shows the mad Ajax to Odysseus. She says, look at him there sitting among the slaughtered sheep. Look at his shame at the ridiculous thing that he has done. And Odysseus feels pity over Ajax's shame. So in this play, at least, though Athena is Odysseus' patron, Athena shares her Homeric moral framework, not with Odysseus, but with Ajax. In Homer, making fun of, rejoicing over, mocking an enemy's shame or an enemy's downfall is perfectly acceptable. The idea that we should treat our enemies with some sort of dignity and compassion rather than mocking them and rejoicing at them, that's a later development. And so Athena, mocking Ajax, rejoicing over Ajax's shame, is acting in an archaic Homeric moral framework. Odysseus, who feels pity for Ajax, is more modern, though Athena is Odysseus' patron. Now, Ajax kills himself a little more than halfway through Sophocles' play, after he makes a long and deceptive speech to Tecmessa and, by the way, to the chorus, which implies that he will not commit suicide. He does, in fact, kill himself, and this is little more than halfway through the play. And this is also very, very unusual in Greek tragedy, or at least in extant Greek tragedy, in that the character Ajax kills himself on stage. He comes on stage, or, well, actually, there's no stage. He comes into the orchestra, the acting area of the Greek theater, somehow plants a sword. I said in the previous lecture, there's very little in the way of movable scenery in the Greek theater. There are some props. He affixes a sword, falls on it, and kills himself. This is a scene that gives theater historians absolute nightmares because we cannot figure out how it was staged. How did the actor playing Ajax mime suicide is one question. More importantly, how did he get off stage afterwards, as we know he had to come back on in character as his own brother, Teucer? Remember, there are only 3 actors. The one who played Ajax somehow had to get off stage and come back on again as another character. How this was managed in the Greek theater, we simply do not know. This is one of the cruxes, one of the problem points of Greek tragedy when we look at it from a staging point of view. We simply don't know how the suicide of Ajax was staged. Normally in Greek tragedy, violent death occurs off stage, out of sight of the audience. And again, I'm using stage here as a kind of shorthand for in the theater where the audience can see you. Normally, violent death in Greek tragedy happens off stage and is narrated in what's called a messenger speech. Someone comes on and describes the terrible, grisly, gruesome events that have happened off stage, so that we don't have the question of how could these things have been staged in the acting conditions of the Greek theater. But Ajax suicide definitely happens on stage. Other characters come on and find the body later in the play, and yet the actor has to be free to come back on as another character. It's a problem. We honestly don't know how it was managed. The rest of the play, after Ajax's suicide, is taken up with the question of whether or not Ajax should be honorably buried. Teucer, Ajax's brother, again played by the same actor who had been playing Ajax, comes and argues for burial, says that Ajax should be honorably buried. Agamemnon and Menelaus argue against it. Odysseus finally persuades Agamemnon to allow Ajax an honorable burial, and that's how the play ends. Now, Ajax is a very, very troubling figure to modern audiences. We don't particularly like his desire to slaughter all his fellow soldiers out of a desire for vengeance over losing the armor. We don't like his coldness to his wife Tecmessa, his indifference to what will happen to her and his son after his death. But within the play itself, he is spoken of with love and with reverence by his wife Tecmessa, by the chorus, and by his brother Teucer. These characters see Ajax as their protector and their strength. They see him as their defender. They admire him very, very greatly. And the very tension or distance between the heroic code of Ajax and the more modern code of Odysseus that modern audiences find so very troubling, this same distance or disjuncture may, in the original audience's eyes, have endowed Ajax with a kind of archaic grandeur. It may have made him seem heroic, larger than life, noble, because it does hark back to the Homeric code of values. So what we find repellent and troubling may, for the original audience, have made him seem somehow more heroic and more grand, more worthy of veneration. Ajax, like all 6 of Sophocles' isolated protagonists, is referred to in the play with a particular Greek word, very hard to translate but very important. All 6 of these isolated protagonists are called by other characters and or by the chorus Deinos. And Deinos is a Greek word that means terrible, strange, frightening, wonderful, all of those things at the same time. We do not have an English equivalent for this word, which makes it very difficult to translate. The most important place in Sophocles' works that I can think of where the translation of this word is most difficult is the beginning of the choral ode in Antigone that's often called the Ode to Man, and is usually translated something like, many are the wonders, but there is nothing more wonderful than man. What the Greek actually says is, many are the things that are deinos, but there is nothing more deinos than man. Many are the things that are terrible, strange, frightening, wonderful in the sense of awe-inspiring, but awe-inspiring with a kind of shiver down your back. Not, man is so wonderful and look at everything he's done, but man is so deinos and look at everything he's done. The protagonists of these plays, including Ajax, are indeed Danos. Ajax, Antigone, the rest of them are both repellent, frightening, and in their splendid and heroic isolation, admirable all at the same time. The isolated protagonist is not the only important characteristic of Sophocles' tragedies. Equally obvious is the almost total lack of direct human interaction with the gods. Athena is the only deity who appears as a character in Sophocles' plays, well, in Sophocles' extant plays. Once again, we don't know about the others. Her role in Ajax is very far from helpful to the human characters. Unlike the Athena of Aeschylus's Eumenides, Sophocles' Athena doesn't solve any dilemmas or give any useful advice to the play's protagonist. She's the force behind Ajax's madness, and she explains that to Odysseus. Moreover, she brings Ajax out of his tent, as I mentioned before, while he's still mad, so that she can mock him in front of Odysseus and goad him into boasting of his prowess. While Ajax is still crazy, Athena makes him boast about all these enemies that he's slaughtered, and of course it's bodies of sheep, not people. Now, very, very interestingly, Odysseus, who is sane, cannot see Athena. He says to her, I can hear you, but I can't see you, while Ajax, whom she has driven mad, apparently can see her. I don't know how far we are justified in pushing that, if the idea is that the gods no longer appear to sane people, but only to mad people, but it is very noticeable in the text, whether we can push it that far or not. It is very noticeable that Odysseus says, I cannot see you, lady, while Ajax can see her directly. So the one appearance of an Olympian deity in Sophocles' extant plays is a profoundly disturbing one. Athena is a very disturbing character in this play. After mocking the mad Ajax in front of Odysseus, she disappears from the play very quickly, and once Ajax has regained his sanity, there's no direct divine human interaction in the rest of the play. And that is typical of the plays we have by Sophocles. Athena's absence from the play after Ajax has regained his sanity reflects the situation in the rest of Sophocles' extant plays. The characters normally have to try to determine the will of the gods through omens, prophecies, and oracles, which are often ambiguous or unclear and open to misinterpretation, and the characters have to try to interpret the will of the gods through their own sense of what their culture teaches about the gods. And there are a couple of points I want to make about that. First of all, this underscores the isolation of the characters. Oedipus, in Oedipus the King, misinterprets the oracle of Apollo, which tells him that he'll kill his father and marry his mother. He misinterprets it because he thinks he knows who his parents are when he doesn't know. He has to try to figure out throughout the play what it is that the gods want, what has gone wrong, and he has to do that using his own wits and using oracles from Apollo that are open to misinterpretation, ambiguous, unclear, difficult, and he gets it wrong. That's the crux of the whole play, that Oedipus's downfall occurs because he misinterprets the information he has about himself and his situation. This also corresponds closely, of course, to the realities of human life in general, as well as to the realities of 5th century Athenian life. We don't normally, most of us, have direct access to the gods. We can't summon Athena to our side or Apollo and say, so what do you want me to do? We have to try, whatever our own religious belief system is, we have to try to figure out what our God or gods want us to do through our own sense of our culture and through whatever kind of tools we have, sacred texts if we've got them, but the Greeks did not have a sacred text. They had nothing like analogous to the Bible or the Quran, or through oracles, prophecies, whatever kind of access there is to what might be the will of the gods, human beings normally have to interpret. And in this regard, Sophocles is the most realistic of the three tragedians, and I think this is probably why his plays are the most popular and most commonly restaged even today. He reflects, in these mythic stories that he tells, he reflects the world of actual human experience. In Greek myth, gods and humans interacted freely. Greek myth is set in a time when the gods did come down and speak to humans, interact with them. Athena disguises Odysseus as a beggar, for instance. The gods are all over the place in the Iliad. In the Oresteia, Athena and Apollo appear in court in Orestes' trial. That is the world of myth. But that most certainly is not the world of actual human experience. And Sophocles' audience assumed that these myths talked about a time in the far past when the gods did interact with humans, but they no longer so interact. And so Sophocles uses stories from the mythic age, but he treats them in a much more realistic way, in a way that reflects the realities of human life, where we do have to try to figure out what we ought to do, what the will of the gods might be, without any direct interaction with those gods. So in this lecture, we've looked at the work of Sophocles, the second great Athenian tragedian. In the next lecture, we'll move on to the third tragedian, Euripides, and talk about how his work differs from both Aeschylus and Sophocles.